Thanks for joining us today for How to Go Carbon Neutral and Benefit from It. As countries begin ratifying the Paris Agreement, companies are facing pressure to move beyond their 2020 targets and establish longer-term climate action plans. Becoming carbon neutral is one of the most affirmative ways to communicate your commitment to climate change. While Tobias already outlined the basic process in part 1 of this series, going carbon neutral can be more complex, and there are a number of key management decisions that companies need to make when considering carbon neutrality. We hope today's webinar addresses some of your questions around carbon neutrality and gives you some good takeaways as you build and implement your climate action plans. My name is Kim Vincent, Sales Executive with SCS Global Services. I am joined today by Tobias Schultz and Jared Carlson. Tobias is the Manager of Corporate Sustainability Services at SCS. He is one of SCS's lead climate change experts and lifecycle assessment practitioners and is pioneering the use of the advanced iterative LCA protocols currently being standardized under the American National Standards Institute. Jared is the Director for Innovation for the Arbor Day Foundation. Jared develops revenue-generating businesses that are aligned with Arbor Day's mission. He spearheaded the launch of their carbon offsetting program and is constantly looking for ways to leverage business to affect change in our world. Today marks part 3 of our 3-part series on carbon neutrality. If you are missing any of the recordings, please reach out to me. Looking ahead to the end of November, please join Arbor Day and SCS at the Companies versus Climate Change Conference in Fort Lauderdale. A few housekeeping items. If you have any questions, feel free to type them as we go in the chat window, and we'll respond to all questions at the end. And you are muted, so if you're experiencing technical difficulties, please use the chat function or shoot me a quick email. And finally, this webinar is being recorded. You'll receive it shortly after the commencement of the webinar. Now I'll pass it on to Jared and Tobias to give a brief acknowledgement of our respective companies.
So the Arbor Day Foundation, most of you are probably well aware, but we're a 1 million-member nonprofit tree planting organization. So we planted and distributed somewhere over 250 million trees across 17 countries. And our focus and our vision is really how do we solve global issues through the use of trees. So obviously today we're going to be talking about climate change and what we can do about that. Trees play a significant role in that, and so that's why we're involved in carbon offsetting and the benefits of going carbon neutral.
Thanks, Jared, and this is Tobias. I'll speak just a moment about SCS Global Services, my company, and then speak about how SCS and Arbor Day are working together. So SCS broadly is an environmental certification and consulting company. We've been around for a bit over 30 years now, offering services as diverse as Forest Stewardship Council Management, Forest Management Certification to carbon offset and carbon footprint verification, as well as developing carbon footprints and climate action plans for companies and helping them on the road to achieving carbon neutrality. So we have quite a broad swathe of environmental services here at SCS. And Arbor Day and SCS are partnering together to allow for a one-stop shop for carbon neutrality services. So SCS can support your organization in evaluating and verifying greenhouse gas emissions, setting greenhouse gas emissions reduction targets, developing policies to reduce those emissions. Arbor Day can step in to help you purchase offsets, forestry carbon offsets, in order to go carbon neutral. And finally, SCS can help verify carbon neutrality and help you to report on performance. So we've been very excited to partner together to offer this one-stop shop for carbon neutrality and make the whole process very streamlined and simple for organizations. And with that background, I'll now get into the substance of today's webinar, which is how to go carbon neutral and benefit from it. So first, just at the highest level, I'll talk about what is carbon neutrality. This is probably a term you've heard thrown around a lot, but it has specific technical meanings when applied to organizations and products that I'll talk through. And so for one thing, it's a key part and has to be integrated into your climate action plan. Right, now, what is a climate action plan? If you joined our first webinar, this will be familiar to you, but this includes steps of first measuring and verifying your carbon footprint. Once you've completed that, you want to set greenhouse gas emissions targets for reduction, create policies to help reduce emissions at your organization, purchase offsets in order to go carbon neutral, and finally verify carbon neutrality to report on your achievements. So really, carbon neutrality is kind of the culmination of a climate action plan where you begin by measuring where you are, take steps to reduce, and then offset, and then finally go carbon neutral through purchasing enough offsets to do so. And if you're interested in learning more about this and you didn't have a chance to join our first webinar 2 weeks ago, feel free to check out our on-demand webinar, Building the Foundation for Carbon Neutrality, Key Elements of an Effective Climate Action Plan, where Jared and I talked about this in more depth. Now a little bit about the two kind of flavors of carbon neutrality, organizations and products. So the steps for organizational carbon neutrality, so this entails evaluating your organizational carbon footprint, reducing emissions, and then purchasing offsets to go carbon neutral. So this means taking the steps to evaluate your organization's Scope 1 and 2 emissions, and then potentially categories of your Scope 3 emissions, that take steps to reduce those emissions and then purchase offsets enough to fully offset them to go carbon neutral. And if you're interested in looking at how to evaluate Scope 3 emissions and go carbon neutral across Scope 3, which is sort of the most aggressive type of climate action you can take for your organization, I encourage you to check out our on-demand webinar from last week, Why Managing Scope 3 Emissions Will Strengthen Your Carbon Neutrality Claim, where we talk more about that. Now, product carbon neutrality, this is the other sort of flavor of carbon neutrality that you could pursue. This involves first evaluating a product carbon footprint using life cycle assessment. So, for example, doing a cradle-to-gate LCA or life cycle assessment of all the greenhouse gas emissions associated with manufacturing, packaging, distribution, usage, disposal, and materials production. Then taking steps to reduce those emissions across the supply chain, and then purchasing offsets to go carbon neutral. So this is the idea of examining your entire supply chain, evaluating the supply chain related emissions with product production, and then taking the steps to go carbon neutral across that entire life cycle of greenhouse gas emissions. So that was just a high level on what is carbon neutrality. Now just a few slides on why you should go carbon neutral and how you can benefit from it. So for one, your customers and other stakeholders are already demanding climate action, whether it has to do with public and consumer interest in more progressive companies that are taking aggressive action on climate, or NGOs that are working already with large companies to take large-scale climate action. There's a whole large number of stakeholders and customers asking for this. This includes stakeholders in the business world, so there's a large movement in the corporate world afoot in support of climate action plans on a policy level, and then internal plans to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and eventually go carbon neutral. So there's already a very large trend in the private sector towards steps towards carbon neutrality. And the rest of the world wants climate action too. Starting in April of this year, on Earth Day of this year, the Paris Climate Agreement was open for ratification, and 175 countries have so far made an agreement under the Paris Agreement. So clearly there's really broad consensus that climate action is required on the very broadest possible level globally in the public sector and in the private sector. And where does carbon neutrality fit in? Now, carbon neutrality is the most aggressive type of climate action possible for your organization. It essentially entails offsetting all of the emissions that you're responsible for. So there isn't a more aggressive way that you can communicate your climate action than carbon neutrality. There's benefits, direct benefits as well for carbon neutrality in terms of great marketing opportunities. And Jared will talk some more about that and some examples of that later on. But you can look at examples such as what UPS did in terms of offsetting climate impact of shipping. Google and Apple have both pursued carbon neutrality across their operations and made a lot of noise about it in different blog posts and conferences and press releases. So there's a lot of marketing benefit and press press benefit, PR benefit that your organization can get from going carbon neutral because it is so aggressive and such a distinctive claim. Now, steps to become carbon neutral. Practically, what can you do in an organization to get there? I talked about it at a very high level in terms of a climate action plan. I'll now dive a little bit deeper to see what it's like to get there, kind of looking under the hood. So step one, as we talked about, was to measure your carbon footprint. So for an organization, this entails evaluating scope 1 and 2 and possibly 3 emissions. For products, this entails evaluating life cycle assessments across all the life cycle stages of production and possibly use and end of life. Once you've completed the footprint for your organization and product, you now want to set targets. So this entails not just emissions reduction targets, which this graph shows graphically, and you certainly need to set short and long-term goals for emission reduction, but this also entails setting a target year for going carbon neutral. It might be a big hill to climb to go carbon neutral immediately as soon as you have first decided to do so, but certainly at a minimum you want to set a target year for going carbon neutral across whether it's your scope 1 and 2 emissions or across a product life cycle. But the point to make here is that carbon neutrality really should be a part of your goal setting early on because it is such an ambitious type of climate action and requires so many steps. It's very important to have it integrated into your climate action plan at an early stage. Once you've set a plan and set targets for yourselves, you then want to craft policies to meet these goals. So some specific policies for meeting emission reduction targets. You can invest in specific greenhouse gas emissions reductions either in your own operations or perhaps work with your suppliers to reduce emissions. You can set corporate policies to help reduce emissions. So for example, you can develop carpooling guidelines or implement shuttle services to reduce commuting emissions from your employees. Or you can take an aggressive step to set an internal carbon price to help control emissions. So that's a good way to provide real incentive for different parts of your business to meet these goals. These policies essentially provide you a roadmap to get to carbon neutrality. And there's different policies you can take to achieve this carbon neutrality as well, different steps you can take to engage with your customers and other stakeholders. As again, Jared will talk more about that, a couple examples of that, different policies for carbon neutrality as well. Once you've then measured your carbon footprint and set targets and implemented policies to reduce your carbon footprint, you then want to reevaluate to see how good a job you've done at reducing emissions. So you want to evaluate any reductions achieved, verify that the reductions achieved in your new level of carbon footprint, and this verified carbon footprint can serve as the basis of your neutrality claim. Now this is an important step, verification of your carbon footprint, to have confidence that the footprint that you evaluated is robust and will stand up to scrutiny in the market. Now once you've gone through these steps of measurement, reduction, and verification of the new carbon footprint, you then take steps to buy and retire verified carbon offsets so that you can go carbon neutral. And these offsets can be verified under the major schemes such as the Verified Carbon Standard, VCS, American Carbon Registry, or Climate Action Reserve. And now I'll let Jared talk more about forestry carbon offsets.
Yeah, I think that a lot of times as people are starting to take a look at carbon neutrality and how to get there, some of the first decisions that come up are, okay, how do we reduce and then how do we offset? And I think a lot of times there's confusion in the renewable energy credits versus a carbon offset. I'm not going to spend an inordinate amount of time on this, but I think it warrants at least talking about as this is, there is a difference. They are completely kind of different approaches on things, but both can be very useful. Basically a REC or a renewable energy credit represents 1 megawatt hour of energy that would be generated from some type of clean source such as wind, solar, hydro. There are a couple of different renewable biomass type things that you can do. But since these renewable energy sources are cleaner or they emit less carbon into the air, then it is, it's a cleaner type of energy. So any emission reduction that actually happens occurs at the utility where the fossil-fueled energy generation is being displaced. So basically, the change is going to happen at the utility that has put up the wind farm. So kind of in contrast, an offset faces a little bit more stricter rules for approval, and really the additionality part is kind of a key aspect of that. And that when you actually do an offset, there is a pretty strict guideline that it is something that is not additional or is only partially additional to what you would have happened otherwise. So then there is the possibility that your emissions will not be completely neutralized if you're going the renewable energy credit side of things. So with RECs, they're typically not on the additionality side, and I've got a little bit of old information. Maybe Tobias could back this up, but I know for on the general, there's a significant amount more of renewable energy that is being produced, megawatt hours that are being produced, than RECs that are being sold. So basically, as you're buying RECs, a lot of this is going to be more business as usual type of clean energy that you're replacing. And that's not to say it's not a this is good and that's bad. It's just they're just different. It's not better or worse. It's just they're simply different players in a similar game. So, RECs would not be a good option to go for a Scope 3 type of emission. But as you're starting to look at your Scope 2 emissions and saying, okay, this is the energy that we're bringing in to utilize for our day-to-day company and for the energy that we need, switching the quote-unquote dirty energy for the clean energy can make a lot of sense as you're doing that. So anyway, just wanted to kind of roll through that because I get that question a lot of as a way, but it can both are excellent tools to be able to utilize. So I want to touch a little bit on what other companies are doing in this sphere. This is something that was pulled from a Forest Trends report, and just kind of gives you a breadth of the different industries. The blue is voluntary offsets, the orange is compliant offsets, and then the gray is someone that has reported but is not currently pursuing any type of offset. As you can see, there's a large scattering of industries, but out of roughly the 2,000 companies that are reporting on the CDP, 17% are currently purchasing voluntary offsets as part of their goals. So I think also another really interesting thing, as Tobias said, people are starting to implement the internal carbon prices. And back in 2014, there were less than 150 companies that had set an internal price. Then in 2015, that number tripled to about 435 companies. And now there are an additional 538 companies that have plans to implement an internal price of carbon to help fund these approaches. And I just think that's a big shift of the way that companies are looking to figure out how do we make this happen, and that's a good way to do it. So, kind of hopping into compelling story, and I think that this is one of the things that's important with carbon neutrality. Oftentimes we get caught up in telling people what we're good at. We're a full service, and we know, we're a one-stop shop, or we've got plenty of experience, and we won all of these awards, and that's all fine and well, but that is not a compelling story to tell. Getting into that why and why you're getting into things can be the better approach for going about it. So more of an example, if you want to switch up just a little bit, would be, hey, we're fighting climate change. It's important to us. It's important to every fiber of our being, and as a result, we're planting trees. lots of them. We're purifying water supplies, we're bringing back endangered species, we're bringing back depressed economies. We realize that we need to operate sustainably so our children can enjoy the world the same way we do. And that's why we've committed to going carbon neutral by 2030 through a strategic partnership with the Arbor Day Foundation, et cetera, et cetera. Here's how we're doing it. What that does in that pledge, and the reason why I kind of just was throwing out just kind of a faux example of what that could be, is it's like a lightning rod for others to join you in that fight, your suppliers, your customers, to get involved. I kind of liken it as going on a diet. So you get it really excited and you're going to go on a diet and you're going to do this, but if you come out and you say, hey, I'm going to cut out 20% of my ice cream, and this is going to be really hard because I love ice cream, but it's really difficult for people to help you out. Even your significant other that knows you really well might say, well, I'm not exactly sure how much you've eaten today, but maybe you should cut out a little bit more on the ice cream. It's difficult for people to jump in and to help you on that. So I don't want to repeat myself too much. We covered this a little bit in the last webinar, but I think it's pertinent to mention again the value of working towards one of the most pressing issues that is facing our generation. By engaging in the fight against climate change, it can be a differentiator in your workplace as well. So employees want to be anxiously engaged in a cause. So if you want to hear a good story that involves motivating employees to the point of making arts and crafts, doing garage sales and bake sales, just give me a call and I would be happy to share. I also shared a little bit in the last webinar, a little teaser, so you can go back and watch that as well if that's something, and I give some more details of how a particular employer was able to really get all of these additional benefits from their employees that they just did not know that that was going to come about as a result. But regardless, the point is increasingly people want their workplace to make a difference. So under a banner of working towards carbon neutrality, you can gain significant support from your employee base. So I think what we need to remember here is that the majority of people want to do something to help fight climate change, but they just don't know how to get involved. So you can help give them that cause to get involved. So in a Nielsen survey back in 2014, they came out and said 55% of global online consumers across 60 countries say that they're willing to pay more for products and services provided by companies that are committed to a positive social and environmental impact. So they're willing to pay more. So if you look at millennials and you run that same thing, that number jumps from 55% to 75% of millennials that said, hey, I'd be willing to pay more if you've got a green product. It's not equal. It's not like I'm willing to either pay for a lesser product and pay more for it if you're committed to these things. It's pretty powerful. And I know there's always a lot of talk about millennials, and it's oh, well, you know, they want to make a difference, they want to do this, and it's the new thing, and everybody's paying attention to it. But I don't think we should discount the boomer generation as those percentages are increasing every year as well. And in this survey, they actually 51% of the boomer generation said that they'd be willing to pay more. So I just think that is pretty significant. Now, when you take that and you go to, well, if everything being equal, would you choose the greener product or not? It's a no-brainer, and it surpasses 90% of what people and how they make those decisions. So this is just an opportunity for a differentiation in the marketplace for your company, for your service, for your products. But these are some powerful facts that can help you gain internal buy-in for your carbon neutrality plan. So if you're interested in seeing more about this research, just send me a quick note. I'm more than happy to help direct, so that way it's not, hey, I heard it on this webinar. It's like, okay, here's the research, here are the things, here, and here's how it is. So, and we know that this message works and that people are responsive. You know, here's just one indicator. This is just a splatter map of our membership. Now, these are people that donate to the Arbor Day Foundation. But I mean, we've got over 1 million members. We've got over 3,400 tree cities that sign pledges. We've got close to 300 college campuses, 200 plus utility companies. We've got partners. Now, these are the outspoken advocates. These are the champions of the cause. But they also need to be given a compelling reason to champion your company and to champion your products.
Thanks, Jared, and I hope we've gotten you interested and excited about pursuing carbon neutrality, and whether you can achieve carbon neutrality in the first year of the effort, you can certainly get started on the process immediately, because you can start the process of evaluating your footprint, setting a plan for carbon neutrality, and actually publicly committing to carbon neutrality as soon as you get started. So while you can't go neutral until you've actually retired carbon offsets, you can publicly commit to carbon neutrality once your plan is in place. And actually a lot of companies are doing this, committing to carbon neutrality by a certain date, by a certain time. So if you're excited and interested, you can certainly jump in with both feet as soon as you can get going. And just to really hone down too on some of the benefits Jared was talking about, on how there's a strong benefit to reporting on your efforts in order to get marketing value. Carbon neutrality is a very powerful market claim. It can help you engage with your customers, and you heard those statistics Jared was talking about. And again, as I said, your organization can make claims about a commitment to neutrality even before the process is completed. So you can get going on that road very early on and start to drive marketing benefit just from taking those steps at an early stage. And this will give you this marketing benefit before the process is actually completed. Now, just to recap this before we go into Q&A, just how to get the most out of your carbon neutrality claim. You want to plan early for carbon neutrality. Be bold yet realistic in what you can achieve. Get the extra mile out of your marketing efforts. Take the steps you can to have the most benefit to your customers and best engagement with customers and employees as possible. And pursuing external verification of the carbon neutral claim can help give it credibility. So with that, if you want help in going carbon neutral, SCS can again help develop your carbon footprint or verify your carbon footprint and help develop carbon neutrality claims, while you can go carbon neutral through purchases of Arbor Day Foundation carbon offsets. So with that, we'll now go into Q&A, and I did want to say that we're offering free consultations for anyone interested in learning how to go carbon neutral. Joint consultations between SCS and Arbor Day Foundation. So if you're interested in pursuing that, please reach out to Kim Vincent at the contact information below, and we'll get it scheduled. Thanks, and with that, we'll take some questions.
Great. A couple of questions have already come in. Thanks, Jared. Thanks, Tobias, for a great presentation. So the first one up is, can RECs be used at all to incorporate into a company's plan for going carbon neutral?
Yes, so I can take this one quick, and Jared alluded to this. I'll just dive into a little more of the technical details. Now, RECs are renewable energy credits. The way that the current standards work, such as the WRI standard, which is kind of the gold standard in this area for evaluating carbon footprints, RECs can be used to minimize the Scope 2 emissions associated with your organization, or the value chain electricity generation for product carbon neutrality, or for product carbon footprints, I'm sorry. So RECs can be applied essentially to those indirect emissions associated with electricity generation. So this means that RECs by themselves cannot get you all the way to carbon neutrality, because they can only address that one scope. And really it's verified carbon offsets that are the universal way to get there. So if you're interested in carbon neutrality, at the end of the day, you will have to purchase carbon offsets to get there.
Okay. Lots of good questions coming in. Thanks, guys. What's the timeline for going carbon neutral? How long does it take?
That's a good question. Now, this varies a lot based on the situation you're in and kind of how far along you are in the process, or whether you're starting from scratch. And if you're interested in pursuing this and getting some advice, I do encourage you to reach out to Kim. We can give you some advice in a consultation. But just at the very highest level, a quick kind of couple points. If you're starting from scratch in this whole process, you'll have to first evaluate your footprint for a given year, then buy and apply offsets against those emissions. Now, carbon offsets and carbon neutrality are sort of evaluated by vintage. So what that means is you can go carbon neutral for a given year, say for 2015 or 2014. So if Acme Company, just an example company, wanted to go carbon neutral in 2014, that would be sort of the vintage is the term that's usually used. And what that means is that the carbon footprint for that year, for the 2014 or 2015 year, that has to be evaluated and verified, and then that number of offsets applied against the emissions in that year. So if hypothetically your organization had already completed your 2015 carbon footprint and had gotten it verified, you could go neutral for 2015 as soon as you had purchased and retired enough carbon offsets. But again, even if you haven't developed a greenhouse gas inventory yet, you can begin that process and commit to neutrality as soon as you have a plan in place. So commit to a target date for going neutral.
Yeah, and also what we've seen is that companies, as they're getting into this process, a lot of times they can draw a circle around a smaller section of something. So they might be able to, obviously we're talking about going completely carbon neutral, but we'll see companies that can very quickly say, okay, here's what it was for travel, and we can go carbon neutral on all of our corporate travel. Or here is this particular product, and we make XYZ product, and the carbon footprint of that is this, and so now we can offer it to our customers as a carbon neutral product by offsetting a certain amount of tons for that particular product. So there are things that you can do to start helping, inch you towards that side of things. Obviously making the full commitment as an organization is what we suggest, but there are steps in between that can help you gain internal buy-in from internal and external stakeholders for moving towards this process.
That actually I think ties into another question that we got, which is, can you make a carbon neutrality claim on just Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions?
Yeah, the short answer is yes, you can make a claim of carbon neutrality on just those Scope 1 and 2 emissions, provided that is transparently disclosed. Going neutral across Scope 1 and 2, this is usually considered kind of the common baseline, like a kind of a de facto minimum. So yeah, you can just do it on just the Scope 1 and 2 emissions. And when you start getting into Scope 3, that's where you can sort of, is very commonly kind of bucketed by category, as Jared was talking about, going neutral for just business travel or one piece or another of your Scope 3 footprints.
Okay. So here's some specific questions that came around that arose from specific terms that we use throughout. And one of them is, can you give an example of an organization setting and using internal carbon pricing?
Yeah, that's a good question. And the concept of an internal carbon price, and it depends somewhat on the structure of the company and the way it's realizing revenue and having costs, is essentially each sort of division or unit of a company would evaluate its own sort of Scope 1 and 2 emissions as if it were an organization in isolation, and then assess a cost of carbon for those greenhouse gas emissions. So that would spur different business units to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to sort of improve their bottom line. So that's the example at the very highest context. There are some large companies that are doing this. I know Disney is one that's made public announcements about it. There's others as well.
Okay. Another question that was specific to the webinar was, what does retiring offsets mean?
So basically, when a carbon offset is procured or made, and I'll use forestry as the example, there is a verification, third-party verification, that that's the amount of carbon that it's actually been captured in the trees. At that point, it can be placed on a registry. Those credits can either be transferred or they can be retired. So those credits can be transferred to be utilized to be retired at a later date, or then sold, or retired basically means that, hey, we did this on behalf of XYZ purpose, And so we're now, if you're doing a carbon neutrality claim, you would retire them on behalf of that organization. And where the registries come in place is just adding transparency to the mix, so that way there's not any double counting anywhere or anything like that. So that's why the registries have their place, is really to add that layer of transparency and build consumer confidence, because back in the day there were some shenanigans that went on. So this is the way of dealing with that, to make sure that that ton of carbon that was captured by those trees is not counted again.
Great, thanks for that, Jared. Great explanation. Okay, here's a company-specific question. So I think this one's for you, Jared, as well. I work for an organization that comprises over 175 employees with over 5,000 trees. I've been told this doesn't count towards our carbon offset. Is that because it's not, quote-unquote, additive?
So there's different types of forestry offsets that you can do, and this will probably be a little bit more technical, but there's an improved forestry management offset that is available that could be. This would probably be more of an offline conversation, but it's not ruled out that could not then become something that would be a generative of a carbon offset, but more than likely a lot of effort for not a whole lot of options on that. So I would suggest setting up a consultation. We can go through that. There is the possibility of being able to generate carbon offsets from that tract of land, but it has to deal with additionality and making sure that if there's something that you do to improve the situation, then there can be claims that are made on that.
Thanks for that. Here's one based on life cycle assessment. Is there a database of life cycle assessment results for common products?
So this is a question that I hear fairly commonly, and there are a couple databases out there. The free ones tend to have lower kind of quality and results. There's one called the US LCA Database that's published by the National Renewable Energy Laboratory of the Department of Energy. There's another free one that's called the EIO LCA Database that's kind of more rougher and less accurate. Our experience at SCS as life cycle assessment practitioners ourselves is that it's very important to select a LCA data source of enough accuracy to achieve the goal of what you're trying to do. So going to a free one or one that's low cost, you may be sacrificing some quality in the final results there. So there are ones out there, and there's lots of other paid ones as well. There's ones like EcoInvent, and very often, you can actually just find life cycle assessment reports online that speak about carbon footprints of products. Things called environmental product declarations contain life cycle assessment results as well. So there isn't, just a short answer, there isn't sort of a single gold standard database for very commonly available products, but very often you can find a lot of information online. That's also something that SCS is able to support you with in evaluating life cycle assessments for specific products your company may be manufacturing or purchasing. We have over 20 years of experience completing LCAs for all kinds of products. So if you're interested in looking at doing an LCA or using LCA to do a product carbon footprint or a Scope 3 carbon footprint, I encourage you to reach out to us about scheduling a consultation.
This one has to do with targets. So is there any methodology to set a specific reduction target? So for example, 30% versus 40% by year X.
Yeah, and actually there's a movement afoot to have more structure in the emissions reduction targets that companies are setting. In prior years it was sort of ad hoc, whatever a company most wanted, without a whole lot of sort of structure around that. But what's begun to develop and become clear and of interest to a lot of large companies is setting targets that are consistent with the greenhouse gas emissions reductions that will be necessary to have climate stabilization at safe levels. So setting greenhouse gas emission reduction targets consistent with a 2 degrees Celsius world or even a 1.5 degrees Celsius world. And there are some methodologies that have been published to achieve that. There's one called the sectoral decarbonization approach, and others being developed. There's organizations like the Science-Based Targets Initiative and the Climate Stabilization Council that are beginning to implement this and have just more science put into place around these targets that companies are making. And which methodology is going to fit for your organization kind of depends on the size and operations of your organization and what you're trying to achieve. So if you're interested in learning more about this and what will be the best fit for you, I encourage you to, again, reach out to us about a consultation.
Okay, I'm going to, oh, sorry, go ahead, Jared.
That's okay. No, I was just going to say, you start to see a lot of, just adding on to what Tobias said, you see a lot of targets being set around 2030, and that has to deal with trying to ebb the 1.5 degree global mean temperature change that is expected. And so a lot of companies are really targeting somewhere around that date as well. Yeah,
thanks. That's a good add. I'm going to combine two questions together. This one's for you, Jared. It's around comparing Arbor Day carbon offsets versus other external instruments. So how do you compare Arbor Day carbon offsets versus, say, other offsetting mechanisms such as renewable energy, et cetera, or RECs? And there was a general question around pricing, but if you could give a comparison between the different external instruments, that'd be great.
Yeah, and there's a little bit more information on this on webinar 1, so more than happy to provide a link there where we go into just a little bit more detail and we can get a lot more granular. But on a very high level, think of the forestry carbon offsets as a net positive gain, and a lot of the other offsets as basically being less bad. So more of abatement versus capture. So what I mean by that is, and it's great, do offsets from all different sizes, shapes, colors are good to do, and capturing carbon is good, but there are projects that you might be able to in a, let's say like in a methane landfill situation where you're capturing that methane and then you're flaring it off or you're burning it, because when you burn it then it creates carbon dioxide that goes into the oxygen or in the air versus methane, and methane is harsher on the environment, so you can get carbon credits from that. And in my mind I'm going, yes, it's better and we should do that. But versus you take a tree and you think back to, 4th grade photosynthesis, the tree eats the carbon and produces out oxygen. So it's got all these additional benefits for what it does. So it's more of a providing additional benefits beyond just the carbon capture, like bringing back endangered species, cleaning the water, cleaning the air. So it's widely accepted as the better way to offset.
Great. Back to Tobias and internal carbon pricing. So, is the internal carbon price or tax set? This is the technical here. Set by each company individually, or is there a reference we can use to set that price?
That's an interesting question, and I'll try to give an answer that won't be too overly general, because the fact is in almost all places there's no government mandate for a carbon tax. You have some places where there is cap and trade programs in place, such as in the state of California or in different parts of Europe, that sort of have indirect carbon tax is what it's often called, but really it just affects to have a price on carbon. So what this means is because there isn't any type of mandate generally, each company is left to set its own price individually based on its own goals and capabilities. Now, in terms of the reference on what you can use to set that price, again, that will very much depend on the company goals and how much the inclination is to reduce carbon emissions. I mean, clearly, if you have a higher carbon price, that would reduce carbon dioxide emissions more by having more of an incentive just based on economics, but it very much depends on what's going to be possible by a different company. So generally, carbon pricing, I mean, if you're talking generally about what the cost of offsets are versus the price on compliance markets, you're talking something in the range of anything from a few dollars per ton up to $10 or $15 per ton. So that's a really rough range on where the type of price might fit in.
And just to add on to that a little bit, a lot of companies, once they figure out what their climate action plan is, they can then do, kind of some backwards math, and part of that plays into, okay, this is a way for companies to generate funds that they can use towards these emission reducing type practices and towards carbon offsetting practices. It's a way for them to be able to equally share the burden and the load of going carbon neutral.
Great, yeah. This is kind of a fun one, Jared. A tree absorbs carbon over its life. When the tree dies and decomposes or is cut down to be used for wood products, does that carbon go back to the atmosphere?
So we take that all into account, but yeah, if you have a tree that falls and decomposes, part of that is put back up into the atmosphere. But you also have to think that a good portion of the carbon that is in the tree is actually down in the soil, all the roots and things like that. So it's still a net positive gain. But we also have things like buffers in place in case that there was something like a forest fire that came through. So we have to bank so much of the carbon to that basically we just store away just in case it's the rainy day fund, in case something were to happen, that at no point would we have to do a reversal and say, oh, by the way, that carbon that you got didn't really happen. So we make sure that that we're covered on that.
Yeah, and I would add to Jared in saying that typically offsets are on a not just a sort of single tree level; they're evaluated on a forest level. So literally, it's important not to miss the forest for the trees, because if you look at a whole forest ecosystem, I mean, you have some trees that are dying in the forest, but then you have more that are coming up and regrowing. So on a larger scale, on the scale of even just a number of acres or larger, then you're talking about a whole ecosystem that's absorbing carbon actively and on an ongoing basis and in a very stable way. So you can have a lot of confidence in forests. I mean, you let them recover and they'll sort of absorb carbon naturally.
Okay, gosh, there's been so many great questions. I think there might be one more that I might have missed. Let me go back through. How do you set a science-based carbon neutral goal, Tobias?
So that's quite an interesting question. I haven't actually heard of that concept before. So science-based targets are generally applied to emissions reductions, but there's no reason you couldn't think of what sort of scientific emissions reduction target would be required to go carbon neutral. Now I'm just thinking through my own knowledge of the greenhouse gas emissions reductions pathway that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and others have projected, and their estimate is that the whole world will have to be carbon neutral by somewhere around 2050 to achieve the 2 degrees Celsius pathway. So clearly we're going to have a big uptick in the amount of companies committing to carbon neutrality and investments in forestry carbon offsets and other carbon offsets to get to that, because that's quite an aggressive a goal required.
Thanks for that answer, Tobias. That was great. Okay, one more. Sorry, thanks guys for these questions. So this one comes back to the forest carbon question that Jared you just answered. What about when the tree is cut down and used as wood products? Does the carbon go back into the atmosphere? Follow-up question.
It actually does not. We don't count that, but that carbon, as long as it's preserved in that wood, you got to think. Maybe you're sitting at a chair or a table right now that's made of wood. That carbon is stored right there, so that's not up in the atmosphere. So it is actually being utilized and not being released up into to the atmosphere.
All right. Another one came through. So what's better, product or organizational carbon neutrality?
So I wouldn't say one is better than another. There's sort of two flavors, and it really has to do with the climate action plan your company takes and the marketing efforts you want to promote. So organizational claims of carbon neutrality are by far more common. They give you a good way to talk about the brand of your company and the sort of sustainability storyline of your company. Now, product carbon neutrality, I mean, that's a more creative claim, but it has a lot of ways that you can have really direct benefits. So, for example, you can aggressively differentiate yourself from your competitors, or you could do things like set up a program where your company or your customers, can, have an option to pay a little bit more for their product to go carbon neutral when they make the purchase. So depending on what you're selling and who you're selling to, there could be a really good way to engage your customers, particularly those ones who are interested in climate action, in a way that's not going to break your bank, but it'll be a really good way to engage and market with them. So I wouldn't say one is better than another. It really depends on the type of marketing strategy you want to employ and the sort of resources you have available to do it.
Okay. Well, I'll answer that a little bit less politically and just say organizational carbon neutrality is better. Because if your organization is completely carbon neutral, then all of your products would be as well. We got to think of the why we're doing this, and we're fighting climate change. So the more you can do, the better. In reality and in all likelihood, a lot of companies struggle to pull that Band-Aid off right at the beginning, and so by picking some products and going carbon neutral and seeing that reaction of customers and people getting behind you helps give people the courage to make larger claims and start working towards that organizational carbon neutrality, would be my opinion.
Okay, back to you, Jared. Does Arbor Day Foundation allow forest harvests on offset land?
Sorry, say again.
Does Arbor Day Foundation allow forest harvests on offset land?
So it depends on the situation, but I would say the way that things are lined up is we work with our partners. We've got some really good partners on the ground that are project developers, Green Trees, and what we do is we work with the farmers to basically layer multiple mechanisms for them to make money. One of those could be harvesting some of the trees that are planted there. I would say it depends on the land, depends on the type and the opportunity, but yeah, absolutely. That biomass can be a great way, kind of going back into, canned wood products that are pulled off, are they emitting up into the atmosphere? And the answer is no. So doing biomass and utilizing that wood for other things is definitely something that is permitted. If it is, and I would say, I don't know the exact percentages, but I would say probably half of the land, I don't know, maybe less than half of the lands that farmers would choose that option, but they can layer multiple revenue streams on it. So one would be harvesting, another would be USDA programs, WRP and CRP programs for additional income on that. And basically what we're trying to do is incentivize the farmers to keep the trees there. Now, at no point in time would we ever sell more carbon than has been captured by that stand. So when we are selling the carbon, we already know what the plan is for that land, and so we only sell the carbon that we know is going to be captured for that land in its entirety. So it's probably kind of a longer answer than you wanted, but it is it's a great way to incentivize the farmers to keep it there. And I mean, we have conservation easements, we've got contracts, we've got everything else to ensure that that those trees stay put there.
Thanks for that question and great answer, Jared. So let's wrap up this webinar. This has been really a very captive audience. Thank you so much for all of your questions. I just want to remind you all that there is a conference that we will both be attending in November. It's in Florida, Fort Lauderdale. The conference is called Companies and Climate Change Conference. Tobias or Jared, do you want to speak to that at all?
Yeah, sure. It's a great conference. They've got an awesome lineup of speakers, so if you've enjoyed this webinar series, you're going to hear some great content. It's a great place to connect with peers and hear what other people are doing and see some case studies of what it is. I think it's just a great way to interact and kind of give yourself some more energy and more ideas to bring back to your organization. The website is www.solveclimatechange.com, or you can just Google companies versus climate change. That comes up. We're actually going to be offsetting the carbon footprint for the conference, so you don't have to worry about adding additional emissions up by attending. So that's a fun thing that we're doing in concert with them. But would love to see you guys. Love to be there. And also, just on a separate note, if you have other ideas for future webinar series of stuff that you want to learn about or things that you'd like us to cover, please feel free to shoot me a note or shoot Kim or Tobias a note, and we'll add that in for the next series.
Perfect. Thanks everyone for listening, for attending. You'll receive the webinar recording for today's webinar shortly, and let us know if you have any further questions. See you on the flip side. Bye.